Okay, so we're back for the second panel, which I couldn't actually come up with a good title for it, so I stole Andrew's title from his essay, Eccentric Projection. So in some way, we're going to be talking about drawing innovations, and I'll try to lay out a little bit of the context as if we need more, but a little bit of the context in a more sort of disciplinary trajectory through the 1970s. And then Andrew's going to discuss some of the spatial diagrams that we used to organize the exhibition. And then we'll open it up by discussing a series of drawings, each of the panelists, one by one. And those panelists, I assume we're all friends here, so I think everybody knows everybody else. But to my right, Andrew Zago, who's the co-curator of the exhibition. He's principal of Zago Architecture, faculty here at SCI-Arc, visual studies coordinator. At the opposite end of the table, we have Annie Chu, principal of Chu Gooding Architects. Annie's an alumna of SCI-Arc and also Columbia, and she's currently on the faculty at USC.
No, Woodbury.
Oh, and she moved to Woodbury since
3 years
This is what happens when you assume you know everyone already. John Enright, who is principal of Griffin Enright Architects and the undergraduate program chair here at SCI-Arc. And then finally, Wes Jones, principal of Jones Partners Architecture, the most fastidiously punctuated of any firm in Los Angeles. He's also faculty here at SCI-Arc and currently leading the solar decathlon team. I wanted to start today just looking at, well, first to kind of come back to the original lecture poster from the 1979 shows, and to point out that this really was, I mean, you can see several drawings on here, the 2468 drawings at the base, drawing the Southside Settlement House, a thing by Moss, Fisher. You see that drawing and a kind of exuberance of drawing was really at the core of this thing, and also with the tools and stuff on there, the kind of mechanisms of making drawings and also hanging them with the hammers and stuff. All of that, I think, was really part of it. And I wanted to just very quickly lay out a kind of trajectory that I felt was significant in leading up to these shows. So we heard a lot about Vietnam and Christopher Columbus and the Big Bang and other significant early influences on the show, but I wanted to look at stuff a little bit more recently and a little bit more specifically architectural to complement that cultural discussion from yesterday. And so I want to go through a series of, just very quickly, a series of exhibitions that I think were influential leading up to the exhibition that we're looking at here. The first one was in fact not an exhibition, but a meeting that took place at MoMA in New York in 1969 and eventually led to this publication, as Paul laid out this morning, first with Wittenborn and then Oxford in 1972. So the five architects, I think this let's say a kind of reworking of the Corbusian language in a kind of neo-modern polemic. This was a group that drawing was a big part of their polemic, and of course in their debates with the Greys, drawing was also part of the polemic. So we instantly see a kind of factionalization of architecture. And one of the deciding or maybe defining factors of each faction was the kind of white Strathmore and ink on mylar that was typical of the whites, and the gray chipboard and Prismacolor of the grays. And I think if you kind of, what you'll see as we work through is the kind of echoes of many of these in the show. So if we look at, say, the work of Frank Dimster, is Frank still here? It's not the Europe Caribbean House either. I typed this out this morning very quickly. But the Euro-Caribbean House, where you see a kind of Guathmy-esque language, a sort of exuberant, formal, kind of compositional aspects. And another exhibition that comes hot on the heels of that show that I think was really important was this one of James Stirling at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. In 1974, this was the catalog in particular went through went to a second edition very quickly, and I think Stirling's particular drawing style, and particularly that kind of pre-Rob Creer drawing style, where Stirling, these kind of clinical ink on mylar constructions, worm's eye axonometrics, a real kind of inventiveness within the kind of confines of the Axonometric was something that show was very good at getting out into the world. And then also, in the catalog, Rainer Banham writes the essay in which he describes Stirling as the man who introduced Pantone to England. So again, this kind of drawing, this technical aspect of drawing being part of it. And of course, these early drawings by Morphosis for the Tijuana medical building, which very clearly looking at Stirling, I think Robert and Craig also kind of working through Stirling at that time. And then a kind of counter to the sort of modernism at the core of the Stirling or the New York Five work was this sort of fairly ruckus-inducing exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1976, the Architecture des Beaux-Arts. And here we see again, you can go back through the Michael Hayes compendium, and where he really lays out the very strong reactions of bringing this seemingly antithetical body of work into the very halls of modernist consecration. So to kind of looking back to 19th century techniques to skip over that modern language that had been looked at in the first two examples and go back to these kind of 19th century techniques, things like watercolor, the authenticity of handicraft, and the sort of mark of the maker, comes into the discussion the form of the analytique, which I think you see in various forms in the show, in, say, something like the Morphosis 2468. And notice also the kind of promiscuity here, where Morphosis happy to do the kind of clinical Pantone axos, and at the same time screw around with Prismacolor and these more sort of alternatively influenced drawing styles in something like this. And then another show, moving a little bit closer to Los Angeles, in 1977, a pair of shows opens, one at the CooperHewitt, one at the Drawing Center in New York, curated by, one of them curated by Robert M. Stern, America Now. And here again we see a kind of yet another move against a sort of modernist sensibility. In this case, you see Robert Venturi on the cover. Stern, in the catalog essay for this little catalog, the show eventually came to Los Angeles. It showed at Otis in 1978. Frank Israel actually had quite a hand in bringing the show out to Los Angeles. And in the catalog, Stern makes a very polemical argument promoting postmodernist poets, he called them, over modernist polytechnicians. So for Stern, again, there was a kind of modern, postmodern debate being formed. And once again, he frames that debate in terms of drawing style. So in that essay, he also says that the modernist axonometric was in some way too clinical and anti-human, and the perspectives favored by the postmodernists were more authentic and humanistic. And for our purpose to notice the drawings of Coy Howard that were represented in that show, and here's just a shot from the catalog with the Hauser and Bodov residences, where once again we see the LA architects, I think, working more across the battle lines than kind of affiliated with one side or the other. So I think, Coy's, certainly the kind of hand of the maker is very much present in the pencil work and the kind of very clearly wrought construction of these drawings, but then super careful geometrically at the same time. So these were doing something quite different than what somebody like Venturi would have been doing. And at the same time, Coy himself actually curated a show at the LA Institute of Contemporary Art in 1978 called Architectural Views, Physical Fact, Psychic Effect, featuring these five architects here, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 5. And again, we see now specifically Los Angeles practices. I'd be interested to hear a little more about, I suspect this show was kind of put on to make sure that it was running in parallel with the Otis show, that there was a intentional dialogue constructed, or that was just luck of the draw?
Yeah, it's when we got the great.
Is that right? There's always a story like that, which I always never quite believe, but we'll take it from Coy that it was fortuitous as opposed to planned. But here again, you can see that the kind of battle lines that I was trying to establish in these earlier shows seem to be not part of the discussion. So this is from the LA Architect magazine. And you see each participant giving a little, just a short kind of theoretical statement or a kind of, why they drew or how they drew or what was the significance of their drawings. You can go back and read them a little at another time. But the one I want to point you out is Robert and Craig, who are here with this fantastic drawing of the super cool upholstery. And over here it says, drawings are a minor part of our process. So I think if we look down the hall, there may be evidence against that. And so each of these, these were shows that I think that trajectory of Los Angeles architects kind of clearly paying attention to what's going on in other parts of the world, but for my money, growing increasingly confident in developing their own sensibilities. And here are just a couple of the objects that were shown in that show. Frederick Fisher's scheme for the Machu Picchu Hotel, Coy's exhibition design for the City and Gold show at LACMA, or Craig and Robert's, here's the minor influence of their process on these incredibly wrought constructions, which are up in the gallery now. And so we became very interested in the inability of this work to be kind of placed tidily in any of these kind of categories that were being established at the time. And so that leads us to Andrew, who I'm going to turn it over to for just a second to talk about the diagrams that we used to organize the show, which are here and are going to be clearer elsewhere.
Point, it's the keynote is off the side somewhere.
This one?
Yeah, it might already open. That's fine. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. There you do.
There's a question. I think it's come up a few times in the course of this show and other kinds of discussions and events related to it. I guess there's always a kind of implicit question, which is how could you take this work, this heterogeneous body of work, and translate it and distill it down into something so minimal and bloodless as a series of line diagrams. And that's an interesting question. And I thought for myself, from the event last night that yesterday afternoon that many of you probably attended, the round table with a lot of the original participants, I think we got an answer. That period, 1979 and the years immediately leading up to it, were, it turns out, we learned last night, incredibly important period of geopolitical upheaval, of social upheaval, technological upheaval, coming on the heels of the late 1960s, the Vietnam War, et cetera. And that what it made here for the architects in that time was a moment of great camaraderie, a moment of enabling a freedom of experimentation, et cetera. These things were really clear, and if you realize that that was the main points that were being discussed and I guess even rehashed over the course of the event, I think it was also an implicit admission on their part that all of these things were very interesting. The work being produced, not so much. So really we had a situation where it was a great moment, and many of these architects went on to do some quite significant things. But if you simply stopped the clock at that moment, a lot of these firms, some of them quite notable prize winners, would not have, maybe have made the kind of, we wouldn't be spending an afternoon talking about it. So that itself didn't seem like it was going to be a good topic for a show. Instead, I thought what it was possible to do was to look at these works, and I think in the catalog I referred to it as being a paleontologist looking at some dinosaur bones, trying to discern the sort of protomorphic origins of wings. Now, well, this one later maybe became something, maybe this is the first time you see this, maybe, and as you start going through that, and as you start looking at some of the original evidence, like the lectures that exist and have been digitized and are available online, some of the original articles, you start to get hints of certain things that were at work. Sometimes they were explicit, sometimes they were kind of half formed, but that there was this idea that a new kind of spatial possibilities were afoot and coming out of this. So it seemed to us that one could draw a kind of retrospective, one could find certain kinds of origins of things that in fact did become important, not only for some of these architects, but for architecture in general, and see some fairly important origins of them in this period, and sometimes fairly unique origins during this period, and that was the motivation for this diagrams. Now, the odd thing is, in the catalog as well as in the exhibition, it's not done in this order, and I want to go back just one second, because part of the reason also that we felt a kind of liberty to work through this, you know, it seems as if what we can do at SCI-Arc that maybe a lot of the other institutions, especially the larger public institutions, can't do, is that we can have a kind of disciplinary discussion. We can do inside baseball, architects speaking to architects, and so the idea was to get at some things that would go to the heart of what we might find important and avoid some of the musty tropes, let's say, of you know, crazy Southern California architecture in the 70s. Now, so I say that because, as we all know, perspective comes before axonometric culturally and technically, and Todd outlined a little bit about these spatial presumptions in his introduction. However, in the catalog and in the show, it's presented otherwise, because even though perspective is historically, obviously, before the axonometric, this was a period in which the axonometric, the parallel projection, the unusual figure being extruded, think of the Pacific Design Center, et cetera, was very much in thrall. And then there was what we are really outlining as a retrogressive tendency, which was postmodernism. It would have been absolutely possible, I think, in every practice, without exception, maybe Coy, I'm not sure, to have done a show that would have been just about postmodernism. All of them, they talk about it in their essays, you know, doing works where they were doing kind of axonometric works and saying, oh my God, what are we doing? We've got to go into the perspectives, placemaking, prismacolor, and precedent, as we call it. So it was a kind of retrogression put in. But if we could have done a different show, which would have been just based on the postmodernism. I think the name then would have been the Heredity of Confections. That was just a build-up for that. I had to put that one in. That's not the show we had. And, you know, I'm showing Fred Fisher's...
We've been talking about how hard it is to write jokes that people laugh at.
I know. But for Muhammad, it turns out. It's very easy. Okay. So Fred Fisher. Look, both the descriptions of these categories as well as the images that outline them and the description of the show, they show up quite nicely in the exhibition, and the catalog essay expands on this. So I'm going to go through these just in a couple of seconds. But so the idea would be then that the parallel projection would be anything from, let's say, the five architects to, in other kinds of figural ways, something like James Stirling, et cetera. And you can see that in any number of works. So the Southside Settlement, the first phase, not the second, by Studio Works, or Eric's first design for the very unusual Pasadena condominiums. Plan rotation, also known as the grid shift. This was dominant on the East Coast. Colin Rowe and his followers, this was a standard kind of postmodernist device, a kind of contraption. It was quite recessive in Los Angeles, I think with the exception of Morphosis, which, as Todd mentioned, dallied in any number of styles of the time. The other one, flat projection, is a little more unusual and not so generally seen. We all know the famous axonometric model by Peter Eisenman of House 10, but what you start to see here is where it really comes into the architecture on one hand. The other thing that I want to mention, which has to do with the show, and I think this afternoon's topic, is we quite explicitly did not make the show about particular projects. We made the show about particular models, drawings, films, and photographs. That is to say that we are claiming for there to be certain features that sometimes exist in one of these formats that aren't necessarily represented in the building as a whole, and sometimes the opposite. So we have, for instance, as an example of a building as a whole, this is a model. It was not yet built in 1979. It's the Hells Angels. This is Frank Gehry's project for the World Savings Bank in Burbank, still exists, where actually the mullions themselves make a perspective of the inside of the space onto the skin, and then one of many examples of one of Coy Howard's draws, where it intentionally takes a ambiguous, not only an ambiguous situation between whether it is an object or a representation, but whether it is two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Then plan rotation may have been common. Section rotation, which we also call crooked construction, that is to say to tilt something like this rather than this, I think, we looked around. You have a fairly hard time finding it before this period in Southern California. And it's interesting because while the plan rotation keeps the tectonic logic intact, the section rotation really throws that on its ear. And this is, of course, we could show any number of works of Frank Gehry from this period. He was experimenting with it most explicitly and even talking about it. But what's interesting is you start seeing it also in funny recessive ways. In Eric Moss's Fun House, you wouldn't think of it as being eccentric tectonics, which became so much a part of his signature part of his work later. But when you look at some of the cross sections, he's actually using off-the-shelf bowstring trusses and simply employing them at an incorrect angle. And then the graphic wrap, this is maybe even more specific. We can find this in a couple of different projects. But as opposed to, say, where Coy would take the three-dimensionality of a house and begin to suggest a construction where it becomes flattened, in the graphic wrap, you actually take a flattened construction and begin to make it, apply it to the tectonics or the three-dimensionality, let's say, of building. It was certainly our inspiration for the entry pieces for the shows. But you see here on the left the unbuilt Fun House by Eric Moss with the chessboard wrapped up the side, and then a grid wrapping around the side also shortly afterwards by Morphosis in the Rydell house. Sedlak house. And then finally, the kind of catch-all, the everything bagel, which is the eccentric projection. At some point, you go beyond simply skewing things or flattening things, and you start having a whole series of increasingly eccentric kinds of spaces and angles and relationships. We know, through deconstruction and other kinds of developments in architecture, that this kind of extreme eccentricity of geometries and spatial constructions ends up being very, very influential indeed. And I go back to, I'm showing here an image of Frank's house, but there could be other examples. On the left is something that really just came out of, where I count as one of the intuitions for this, which is Eric Moss in his '79 talk referring to the Gunma, a theater in the Gunma Museum by Arata Isosaki. And after much scrounging around, it turns out that in a theater that is basically, I would categorize as a kind of axonometric project, he has a couple of drawings where he shows this eccentrically rotated cube that's then projected onto the inside walls of this rectangular theater, and in fact it's painted on there as a very fine line. And so already at this time there was, and we'll talk I think about other instances of these kinds of exceptional geometries popping up in the world at this time, but that's the end of the kind of logic of those diagrams. Thank you.
Okay, so
This is,
what the hell did I just do? I don't know how to work.
I think, are we doing this so we know who we are?
Yeah.
In case we forget.
So that there you have the kind of background of the show. There are just some other slides, kind of other examples of that stuff. In particular, that Gunma Museum with the projected dissipation of the cube. What I've done, just to kind of kick off the conversation, is that I asked each panelist to give me a drawing which they could just kind of talk about for a few minutes and just to kind of get the conversation going. The drawings, I requested drawings of that time, plus or minus several years, or 10 in this case. But really it's more to kind of take a look at that Los Angeles idiom, or purported idiom, and really just try to take it apart and talk about how some of this work influenced the various panelists. So we'll start with Annie, and then we'll kind of move through.
I thought it was important to just have a little pull back position to see where Frank Israel's office in the cohort at that time was coming from. Frank was educated at UPenn, Rome Prize winner, lots of influence there. And the people that happened to be in the office at the time when this project was happening, including myself, had recent or long experiences in the East Coast. And so what was interesting was the book that was always out in the office was, in fact, that linen-covered Louis Kahn monograph, which is kind of surprising. And also what we brought, the cohorts from the East Coast brought all our ink on Mylar experiences, which was the kind of technique of the time, both for representational drawings as well as construction documents on the East Coast. And of course, for myself, it started here actually at SCI-Arc, with Frank, actually with Robin Mangorian, who was famous for bringing his little loop, magnifying loop, to each of the final drawings and checking your ink corners. For the idea is that the rapidograph pen, which is now this kind of dinosaur thing, when it makes a 90-degree corner or whatever corner, it will essentially still be a kind of rounded profile, and you must then take a straight edge razor blade and flick those corners until it becomes perfectly 90 degrees. And so this whole idea in the East Coast, also the high modernists with the New York 5, working under Todd Williams' office, as well being the first employer, Richard Myers, basically the idea of the ink on Mylar drawing is a kind of sense of the carryover of the kind of attitude and tradition of the rigor by which you're supposed to approach the kind of making of a building. So in this case, the UCLA Southern Regional Library was in fact the largest commission for Frank Israel at that time, only in his, I think this is when he was 45. He died when he was 50 in 1996. And also his first institutional project. So, of course, these drawings were done for the monograph, his first Rizzoli monograph, which Joe Day was a big part of the kind of writing for that monograph. In this particular drawing, I think that it does hark back to the Beaux-Arts Analytique, which in fact, different modes of understanding or declaring the attitude of the buildings was actually shown in the same drawing. Of course, this is totally contaminated by the teachers at SCI-Arc at the time, with the drawings that done in Morphosis, with Coy Howard via Billy Tien. Of course, this is not one of those atmospheric drawings, but in fact, this kind of composite drawings of seeing many views at the same time was really important to us. So you can see that this is a kind of ironic project in a way as the drawing goes. It's a 3-story, 90,000 square foot building on the western edge of UCLA that 2.5 stories was actually sunken below ground. And the whole goal of this building was not to be seen because it was right across the street from the Westwood Homeowners Association. So the building itself is done in reinforced concrete, but the cladding is actually precast concrete. And what you're seeing is basically on the top, kind of a larger plan detail view of the precast concrete as is being cladded onto the actual structure of the building, as well as a large elevation of the 2 panels that you see in kind of reverse black with this kind of Scarpa-esque kind of motif, all the way down to the scupper, various sections and elevations of the drawing as well, strewn around the area in terms of the wall sections, etc. And then, how does this go? So here's the big elevation of one of the panels, another panel, the scupper, which is the only way that you can actually show a particular function of the building. It's a windowless building that's only for storage of low-use books in the UC region. Here's that enlarged plan of 2 panels, one to the other. And you can see the profile of it, the kind of motive force, borrowing Peter Cook's term, was to try to declare the seriousness of this building, even though all we're working on is really the cladding and the profile. So here you see a series of numbers that actually represent the profile depth of the precast panel. It's west-facing, so these are the jumps and profiles similar to the jumps in line weight and ink drawings by which a shadow can cast, and you can actually see the differences in the thickness of it. So I think that's probably all I can talk about. Here's a site plan, a different scale of the drawing, side elevation on the west facade, south facade, and then the west facade elevation, mostly buried. And then 2 wall sections here, the one that's on the short side, the one on the long side, and then this kind of buried section that you actually see here.
Can I just ask you, how did you
Yeah.
reverse out the line work?
I wasn't going to sort of give out the
No, I just
technique.
want- Did you actually draw the black around?
This is like, I thought that this was, I get to that point, because when I actually pulled this out, I remember the technique. This is just right before the first computer entered the office. At that time, the computer was used mostly for word processing only, not for drawing. So this was actually done in a series of separate drawings. So there's probably a good 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 negatives and positives of negatives taped together by ruby lift tapes that we used at the time, and this little silver thing that masks it off. And basically it's a kind of analog, handmade way of splicing together negatives and reverse negatives in order to make something like that happen.
So, John, you're up.
Well, I have to say that I was away last week, and Todd emailed me and said, I need an image from you. And I picked one, and then he said, Zago already picked it. You can't have it. I said, okay, so I went the complete opposite direction, but when we get to Andrew's, I want to loop back
I'll
to
let
it.
you talk.
But I guess I got second instead. This, of course, is Stirling's Stotts Gallery project, which spanned from 74, built in 84, but designed from 74 through 79, I believe. And first of all, I want to loop back a little bit. I want to commend Andrew's ability to stitch this work together in a really smart way. I really enjoyed those diagrams and the way you looked at that work. I think that's a pretty difficult task, and it's an interesting combination between the two of you, looking at it and positioning the work in a certain kind of way. And of course, all these characters never wanted to be as part of a group, yet you're showing them as a group. And I think the way you've done that through drawing, what I hope we talk about today, through the discipline of drawing, which is still alive certainly at this school and has evolved, is a really good way to look at the work and be a little bit more detached from it in a way. So with Stirling and this building, for me, which personally, when I was starting my architectural education in about 1980, 1981, this drawing and series of drawings had a huge influence on me. And historically, certainly, maybe it's the only postmodern building that I still show to students. And maybe it bookmarks and kind of ends that discussion for me within architecture, and certainly in the academic circles. I believe it's a kind of end point right there in about 79 to 82. But one of the things, and Todd was talking about the clinical notion of drawing, and so it's interesting, it'll be interesting to see all the drawings when they come up, but so far now they're all line work drawings. And I believe that for architects, and this discussion, I would like it to hopefully be clinical in a way. I like that word, clinical. That connotes a notion of expertise, of architects talking to other architects. And this drawing in particular, what we used to call a frontal axon, even the discussion between isometric drawing and axonometric drawing, which is so interesting. You see very few true planimetric, axonometric projections today because of the 3D software. They're almost always isometric, meaning the plan is not regular. So the circle or the drum of this space is a circle, so it's projected down, but it's actually an elevation and a plan together because of the choice and the judgment of the author to take that position of the project, which what it does for me and what it says to me is that he's playing with a series of objects, which when he describes the project, he talks about abstraction versus representation, and the ramps, the entryway, the asymmetrical pieces are offset simply by choosing this one position to frontally look at the work. I think on another perspective that we see in a lot of the work of the exhibition architects digesting through what I would say a kind of historicism. And certainly with this building, the author Stirling wrote a lot about Schinkel and the Altus Museum and made no qualms about it being derived from that, in fact, and had given his kind of final critique on the modern project. But what I find interesting, and Andrew, maybe I have a difference of opinion in this, the architects working in the era of the show seemed to want to shed some of that historicism and didn't bring that baggage as Stirling does within their work. And certainly in the decade that followed '79, and me being around SCI-Arc at that time, there was a conscious effort to shed that, for better or worse, I would say. So anyway, this is my drawing.
All right. Who's next? The order, I'm not sure. Well, Wes.
Yeah, there we go. Now, who picked that drawing?
Okay, well, first I would like to apologize for consulting notes. In my dotage, I have to do that, or I'll just make a hash of whatever points I was trying to make by picking this drawing. But first, then, I would want to say that you'd have to understand the drawing, or understand that drawing for us was primarily or exclusively in support of the architectural efforts. Architecture here being broadly interpreted to include a kind of view of the world, as well as any actual efforts that resulted in built work. So the point of picking this drawing was not only that it was influential to me, but for the contrast that, on the one hand, it provides to the work of the show that we are, in a way, reacting to, let's say, with these choices, but also that there is a certain strand of continuity with some of the examples in the show. But for me, the major reason to show this drawing was that it serves as a gesture of reaction, let's say, against the personal character of the work in the show, the gestural aspects of it, the hand, all of the stuff that you would expect to be talking about in a show of drawings and architectural models. Interestingly, it also stands as precursor 30 years ago to what now has become popularized as this object-oriented ontology thing. Back in the day, we understood that as just, making architecture in a world dominated by gravity, filled with objects, and therefore in contrast to the kind of virtual reality that you can enjoy inside the machines these days. So, in talking about the drawing, I'm really kind of talking about what it represents in the work itself. And as a reaction to the work that we've been seeing, I think, in the show, it represents my, and the work of my office at the time, sense that the disparity in the stuff, the way that the grouping was an artificial grouping among these guys was due to the fact that they were not attempting in their work, in our view, to be making a world out of this. This was all very intensely personal work, deploying what I would call empty disciplinary effects. The issue has already been made and glossed over that there is no reference to social issues, despite Tom's protestations yesterday. And even earlier here, there was no particular reference to the world at large in the work. It was a discussion among individuals, very much in competition, but competition within the narrowest world of architecture and publication. And to me and my fellow students who were looking at this work, we were both refreshed by the fact that they were interested in the production of the work, the making of the work, as we had to be, because we, as students, couldn't actually look beyond that to making architecture. We had to satisfy ourselves with the work, and here was a bunch of guys who was making some really, at the time, stunning work, and so there was a connection there, but it seemed to us, again, disparate and kind of selfish and empty. Maybe I shouldn't be speaking so harshly here, considering, they may not have a chance to rebut me here, but that was very much how we felt about it. I had an interview when I was a student with Craig, and who was incredibly gracious, gave me an entire afternoon. We went to Rose Cafe and hung out and talked about architecture all afternoon. But what we talked about, and again, this is no criticism of Craig in particular, but maybe more of the architectural culture of the time in LA, we talked about the possibility of inventing an idealized matrix in which all the sort of stylistic possibilities could be laid out on two axes, and you thereby could identify the holes that were missing and yet to be filled. You could say, okay, if you do, axo plus this, plus this, plus this is unexplored territory. This is a new kind of architecture. It had nothing to do with any kind of reference or relationship to the world as a whole. But so again, and I also wanted to make because we're in school here, make a little bit of an equation here about this idea of the relationship between the drawings and the work. If architecture is supposed to place us in the world, if it's supposed to become exemplary of a world that should be or could be, then all of these disciplinary effects that we have talked about, that were deployed so well in these drawings and all, are satisfying in themselves, but not necessarily referential beyond that. So architecture, I would say, has to equal discipline plus meaning. If it's going to place us in the world, you can't be satisfied simply with talking shop among the practitioners of the discipline, if that discipline is ultimately architecture. You have to contextualize it. You have to place it in relation to the larger issues of the world. As a corollary, I think that all of the discussion today about affect, Jeff defined affect as those effects, architectural effects minus significance or meaning. And so I would make a distinction here between discipline and affect there, in that disciplinary effects would be those in which whatever meaning that can be attributed to them are strictly architectural within the field, whereas affect is effects that are absent even architectural significance. And so I would say that this drawing is intended as a kind of a criticism of an intensely personal engagement, but absent that larger connection with the public or publicity that or the other side of the publicity that we talk so much about over the last few days in this stuff. And so, in our practice, we always made drawings that ironically came to be understood as signature drawings, but were intended from the outset, as Annie pointed out, using ink and mylar, to efface the hand, to erase the personal gesture, to be as objective and neutral as possible, conduits to the intended construction at the far end of it. To a certain extent, engineering drawings as tools to produce the buildings rather than artifacts in themselves.
Okay. I just wanted to say hi to Laura.
Yeah, I assume we're live. I'm actually getting criticized for using the everything bagel as a metaphor by text. So, just so you know, everyone knows we're live. This is the drawing that I stole from under John's nose, which is the
That's what you get for going on vacation.
I think it's the Burroughs Law, one of the series of 10 Micromegas drawing done by Daniel Libeskind. I spoke at length already. I'm not going to make a long point out of it, but I think it's a little bit of an important one. First is the date, and if we think about the kinds of geometric progress that I was outlining there, and think about even the most extreme construction in terms of its eccentricity, let's say Frank's own house or maybe the Wagner house or something else of his by that, of that period, nothing would come close to the kind of, insanely complex spatial arrangements that one sees in the Micromegas. I bring that up, though, not actually entirely as a criticism, and I do want to tie this into what I could see as a kind of positive aspect of yesterday's roundtable. I mean, what I think is incredibly important about this drawing, and it's important to understand it as being contemporary with a lot of the work we're looking at, is I think this was, there was lots of, it's possible to discuss an interest in drawing and then show a bunch of stamps. It's possible to discuss an interest in drawings and show work by Lebbeus Woods. It's possible to do any number of things, but I don't think it should be a kind of generic discussion. I think if you want to talk about it as things that really speak to the heart of the discipline, I think you would look at this, and this probably, as you know, Libeskind at this point was not so many years out of the Cooper Union, where he was one of the sort of star products of John Haydick's program there. But the thought here was that the kind of intuition that there was a kind of quasi-autonomous life possible for the production of architectural drawings, I think here almost literally explodes. And here the thought that there could be a space within architectural drawing itself, which I think has always existed as a potential, here becomes explicit, and I think as part of its legacy, and I think SCI-Arc and lots of the discipline as a whole still has to sort of grapple with it, is that it actually became a problematic. It was shown to be possible to exist as a, if not an independent spatial, an autonomous spatial construction, certainly a severely quasi-autonomous. So I wanted to point that out because in terms of that kind of pure investigation, I think things were much further than what was going on here. One thing that was pointed out last night, and it's true, and this is an odd thing for me to stress because it's so often used in a kind of justification of a kind of brutish pride in building, is that the architects here were building these things. And so I think in a certain way, while maybe the pure research was going in one direction at that time, it was through things like, Frank Gehry and then Coy's work, and increasingly with Morphosis and with Eric and others, there was this idea that this was not simply speculation at a remove from the construction of buildings, which was, let's say, to some minds just horribly corrupted, but was actually possible to not separate those two things. And it turns out, if you know Daniel Libeskind's work since then, and you know the work of some of the stuff I was kind of making fun of, what happened to some of these guys later, it turns out in certain ways they were right, and this kind of sheltered investigation, as important as it was and as important as I think it continues to be, it didn't prove to have the kind of legs when it came to the wholesale transformation of the actual making of architecture.
But I think it was important to kind of acknowledge, too, that for Daniel Libeskind, especially during this year, 1979, you have to kind of remember that two things happened. One is he actually declared that the drawing process, as autonomous as it is really actually an intuition. He actually used that term intuition. And he acknowledged that that's a process that's tethered to potentially later on the build project, but it's totally independent. It's a kind of speculation, but in the most sort of free, liberated sense. But at the same time, 1979 is around the time Max Protech happened, the Max Protech Gallery in New York. For the first time, architectural drawings become a commercial entity, kind of a cool commodity at the same time. So I'm wondering if that kind of autonomous declaration, of the kind of architecture drawing as a means unto its own,
right,
and then this kind of commercialization of that artifact,
right,
is hand in hand at the same time when there wasn't that much work going on for the young architects.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think also commercial opportunity and artistic advancements are, that's why we can study the history of painting through paintings of the Madonna and Child, because it turns out there was a big market for people who needed these paintings. And
yeah, I think as a student at the time, I have to say that's actually something that hasn't been remarked as much, despite the fact that these guys were very interested in building, as we heard about. The chief avenue to their fame, at least for the most famous among them now, being PA. Of course, the PA Awards were for unbuilt, though intended to be built work.
Right.
And so most of their work
lied about, right?
yeah, so most of their work was known through model photographs and drawings, and such. And it was absolutely true. I remember working in Peter's office in New York that there was a whole part of the office that was devoted entirely to producing drawings to be shown in Protect, Castelli, and galleries like that. That this was, a whole another mode of production beyond something that was supposed to end up in buildings.
Well, I think, maybe a little less cynical attitude to look at it, though. And as long as there have been architects and they've been doing drawings, there's been, let's say, a therapeutic aspect of working through problems through the medium of one's choice. Some have the ultimate goal of building a building, others don't. I think this is true today, that even in economic downturns, the proliferation of the architectural image or drawing increases as opportunities lower. And I think this is a kind of natural thing. I think what's more interesting to talk about is, this image versus your fighter plane that you put up. And I would say that the work in the gallery is somewhere in between, because I see architects almost dissatisfied with the project itself they're working on and using manners of drawing to go beyond the project itself, which, in the 80s there was a lot of criticism of that kind of drawing, a kind of post-production. In other words, the drawings of the project were more interesting than the project itself, right? Versus this drawing, I think, which is something else, which is an architect. There is no airplane behind this drawing. There is no project.
There is no possible airplane.
There is no.
Right.
No, there is, but
No, when he built this as a model, it was
right,
a different thing.
That's right, because there are tricks of play. If you zoom in to any one of these little pieces, you'll see impossible spatial connections, Escherisms, et cetera, which is what he's kind of working through. I mean, this is what's interesting to me about Corey's here, his draws, because, there's the one piece that has I suppose it's an isometric projection on the large piece. It seems to me you've gone through great effort to suppress that architectural part of the drawing itself, and it seems to be taking it completely somewhere else. It has traces of architecture in it, but that you were looking towards the sensibility of a project more. And I find that really interesting within the...
I was just going to answer for Coy.
Yeah. Well, he can shout it.
You can correct me, because we had a couple discussions about this when I was at first. I asked him about the draws, and also that's why I just wanted to pull out one of those photographs, because I think what you said was you considered, because I think at one point you said, well, maybe we could show these photographs, and you said, well, you would consider those photographs to be a certain kind of set of works. You consider the draws to be a certain work, and the buildings that they represent also to be a work, and you work on a kind of, I don't know, maybe you didn't say it this way, but a kind of sufficient existence of each one as a thing in and of itself. Is that mangling what you said, or sufficiently?
But also, John is right. To me, I always thought that practice I wanted to be in was a creative practice. I never really thought of it as architecture per se. So everything I did, I tried to do in the most creative way I could. What that basically meant was that I was pushing my own level of understanding of what this thing was about. So in the draws, it was always that kind of double capture. You do it this way, and you do it that ultimately was really about me trying to figure out how to do architecture. So it really was a sensibility thing. I was trying to figure out the material sensibility, the sort of qualities I wanted to have in space.
Now, I want to put just a little bit more pressure on this question because I think it's come up in a number of different ways in different aspects of the project, in the research, and in some of the writing, and in these conversations the last couple of days. And it has to do, for me anyway, with the difference between making a drawing and making a thing. And as I was listening, you know, Wes, for instance, I think the Skyhawk, this was a drawing about making a thing, right? There is absolutely something behind this drawing, and it's an airplane. And whereas, you know, we go back to the Libeskind, and in Robin Evans' famous essay about these drawings, which is called In Front of Lines That Leave Nothing Behind, that in fact what Libeskind was doing with this series of exercises was flipping the kind of hierarchy of information in an architectural drawing, that generally the drawing was a way to kind of work through the drawing to an object somewhere else. And what Evan's argument about Libeskind was that you constructed the drawing with exactly the same techniques, the same disciplinary conventions, the same skills in order to make impossible the projection beyond that drawing, that the drawing had to be taken as the thing itself. And so when I, you know, in listening to the way that the four of you described the drawings that you showed, it seemed that 3 out of the 4 described the drawings primarily in terms of the drawing is the end game, right? And with Wes being the exception. When I was early on in the research, I was talking to Ray Cappy, and he said something really interesting that it's in the catalog essay, but he says, you know, at that time, I couldn't quite figure out what these guys were up to. I mean, they were just drawing the hell out of projects. You look at Robert and Craig, and they were just drawing so much more than was necessary, so much more than was necessary not just to build it, but that was necessary to understand it. You know, it was more than you needed to get it. And I realized it's like, so for Ray, an issue was that there was a kind of excess, that they were drawing more drawing than you needed to understand the architecture. You didn't need the architecture to understand the drawing. And I thought that, in fact, what started to happen in this period was that you didn't need the building to understand the architecture. That at a certain point, a kind of independence between the thing projected and the projecting device started to swerve conversations in the discipline in a different way. And especially, you know, I was thinking, Wes, being a nerd, I went back and tried to look up when this drawing was made and, you know, because I wanted to have the dates right. And I noticed that this drawing was in fact drawn in 1999 by somebody who was not an airplane maker. And it is actually a celebration. You know, it's clearly a kind of fetishization of that object, but it's after the fact. You know, in a way, this is like a drawing about drawing just as much as some of these others that we're talking about. So I think that tension between where is drawings placed, not just in the kind of hierarchy of objects related to architecture, but also, you know, the instability of those hierarchies, you know, that it's constantly flipping around. And I think your drawings are a case in point, you know, that they are something that I mean, when I was in school, we had your books out a lot because of the drawings. You know, like how do we make that black
ironic,
so
yeah.
black and all that.
This is the shit that Eric always gives me,
Yeah.
you know, in these things.
Well, I could
it's
say-
as intensely personal as his work.
Well, let's put that to the test, but not in that way, I would say, because I mean, you talk in your work a lot about judgment, right? And so let's look at this drawing. There are a series of judgments done by the author. For instance, the bomb that's shaded, right? Like, you know, why is that shaded?
Excuse me, John, when you turn away,
Oh, sorry. The bomb is shaded, right? It's taken from a certain kind of angle, which is a judgment.
Belly tank, by the way, not a bomb.
That's a what?
A belly tank.
He says it's a belly tank.
Hey, it's
for
a
gas.
GBU 116B1 1,000 pound laser guided
Oh,
bomb.
it is a bomb. Okay, I stand corrected.
Okay.
But I will say that the reason that this is an older drawing is because the original set of drawings, I couldn't find a high enough resolution
Yeah.
one, because they're
No, I couldn't
scheme.
either, because it sort of
Yeah.
flipped me out. When I saw the 99, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
shit.
I couldn't find an earlier one with a high enough res.
But I guess my point is that even in the most, let's say, clinical type drawing,
Yeah.
there's a series of judgments of view of how things are exposed, how things are drawn, et cetera, which one cannot get away from. Therefore, it has a bias. That was my point with
Right.
Stirling's drawing, was this purposely taken from a certain kind of view in a certain kind of way to exhibit a certain kind of manner and assemblage of space.
But the point here, I'm not trying to imply that there's some bad faith on the part of these guys, however it came out, by trying to, get away with anything or be satisfied with drawings rather than building, because clearly they all were very interested in building, and I'm totally respectful of the idea of working through drawings to figure stuff out, as Coy was mentioning. My concern in bringing it up now would be simply that we are entering an era with a technology where the separation between the two becomes kind of easier and easier, and so the drawing as a end in itself floats free from the initial impetus to produce it. And so clearly there's as much, which would be ultimately the building that would be out in the world and affect the world. Clearly, even in a drawing like this, the attempt to be as objective and neutral as possible, as we know from epistemology, is as doomed as any other. But what is important to me is that there is at least the intent to, again, in this case, efface the individual from that, the personal gesture, the personal flourish, which would otherwise be imposed out there on the world, in the body of the building, upon all the other poor suckers who are going to inhabit that building. It is to remember the ethical foundations of architecture.
But does this drawing do that?
In a different way. Just because it has fewer lines.
No, for me, it's not about fewer lines, but I think the suspension of individual authorship, I mean, it's quite common. It's a very common part of
so
the
this
scholarship
drawing
on
is definitely
Stirling
more in line with what
of
I'm...
how, Stirling worked very hard to make sure that you couldn't tell which guy in his office made the drawing, and until Creer came around, it becomes
Ironically, in
very
this
hard.
case, though, I would say it's the architecture that
Yeah.
is
hidden
is
in the
not
drawing.
doing well. Yeah, but I'm saying that the gestures, interestingly, are actually in the forms that are being depicted as neutrally as possible here.
But
Right.
could you just bring that all over to all the drawings that are, that we've been talking about, architecture drawings? Look at them in two categories, perhaps like one paradigmatic and one idiomatic, right? So in this case, this drawing explores both, I think, in terms of both the paradigm and the idiom of that, whereas maybe the Skyhawk's ambition is only in the idiomatic. I don't know, just popped
Yeah,
in
I
my
think the
head.
ambition part of it, again, at the end of the day, the architect isn't there to explain their work. The intentions don't really count, except to the extent that they become evident in the work, and there's obviously a lot of discussion about the possibility or not for that. But I think while we are in school debating things, the intention to communicate and the intention to be communicated is important. So I think that, in fact, whether it succeeds or fails, the ambition of the engineering drawing is to communicate as accurately and efficiently as possible a desired outcome. And again, I'm not saying that the architectural drawing itself is not a worthwhile exercise, or model is not a worthwhile exercise in its own right, and we obviously engage in that to a certain extent, but the ambition we're trying to communicate in that is this self-effacement, and maybe the impossible struggle in that, the fact that, as John pointed out, ultimately that's impossible. But it is a gesture on our part, a demonstration, we would say, of good faith, that we're not trying to impose our view of things on everybody else. We're trying to take ourselves out of it. Now, again, that's obviously a losing proposition as well. But in order to earn the right to impose these views, you have to, in my mind, you have to go through all that.
So with like, for example, Micromega being almost opposite of that, because it's not an engineer drawing,
Well, it's
a
clearly
clinical
intended
drawing,
as art,
and
yeah.
it's about an exploration of paradigms, right? So I'm still trying to sift through the paradigm versus the idiom, and whether the architectural drawing became more elevated into the status of art because of his paradigmatic explorations versus the idiomatic explorations? Because the idiom seems to be bound within the kind of technology and the actual
Clearly,
medium of
it
his
has
time.
become the subject
Right.
of the drawing itself. So he's using the tool, not only the tools, but the techniques here, the dotted lines, all of these things that we have come to fetishize as being related to this series of drawings.
But not particularly overboard. I mean, these are kind of conventions that are
This is a simpler one.
simpler ones of them. But like thinking about the history of him as a accomplished musician before he actually got into architecture, I wonder if this is more of a cathartic sort of unpacking of all his physical
Well, yeah, he had
reaction
issues,
towards
with being
space
in
and music.
architecture.
Yeah.
Whereas I would say that, for example, some of the Morphosis drawings that you were involved in were as easily as wrought, things using all of the idiomatic gestures and tools. There's not in a way, you also work in ink and mylar, so you kind of take the hand out of it, but you've got all these things to work with, the dotted lines, the different line weights, the curves and stuff like that.
Ink on board.
Yeah.
Ink on board.
Erasing.
Oh, even more insane. Yeah, wow.
And the white lines were simply left.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, because I thought that might be what she had done.
I think it's interesting, yes, that should be said, that those 6th Street drawings that Andrew worked with Tom Main in 1986 were done on Strathmore board with pencil underlay and constructed complete. But I want to talk about, she was talking
Did you
about
use a ruling pen?
This is without, right. The rigor, okay.
What do I have?
The rigor of representation of that era, of which those kind of things are part of which the exactoing the corner of the round rapidograph corners, etc. I mean, this comes up a lot, with the kind of nostalgia of drawing and is drawing dead, etc. And, I think it was a few weeks ago, Andrew, you had some of your visual studies student work up. And I would say that that rigor still exists, it's just shifted platforms. So I was looking at those drawings with you, and these were huge 3-foot by 7-foot kind of, how would you describe them? It was kind of matrix in color print, super high resolution. Got to be over 600 dpi, I would think. No, not that bad.
Would make grown computers cry.
Right. And we were looking at them, and my eye was this far, and I was looking at it, not unlike some of these constructions, and then looking at it back. And to me, that kind of rigor or attention to, let's say, the smallest pixel or printing possibilities still exists in this building,
right.
And it's still robust. I think, so when people ask me all the time, how is it you don't draw? I mean, for the general public, drawing seems to mean sketching or drafting, I guess. And I would argue that they've just shifted focus. It's changed everything.
But it also brings up a really interesting question again about the status of the author in that, because the author is sort of mediated by a series of machines, between the hand of the author and the paper on the wall. There's a lot of machines in the middle, and I don't know, somehow the obvious handicraft of all of these, for anyone that knows how to make one of these drawings, is you can't but think of the sweat and blood that goes into making them.
The skill.
And the skill.
But there was,
so I wonder how do we get into that question today, given that the skill, it's not the skills are gone, but the skills, as John says, are quite different.
But I just want to say, if I just go back to this, because I think if you look at these, and there's actually, as Todd knows, which I didn't know, there's a series of pencil drawings. Jeff had them as part of his exhibition, Perfect Acts of Architecture, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And then after that, there was a series of silk screens made of it, and this is one of the silk screen prints. And there is really, other than, the inconsistencies of the dashes and things like that, there's really no evidence it's not really about evidencing hand. You would try to make sure that wasn't there at all. But it's also funny in that, like in reference to the drawings that were here in the hallway that you were talking about, in a certain way, they were better than, in terms of a virtuosity, they were better than these. And there is, so there is.
The ones in the hallway.
Yeah.
The contemporary.
Yeah, just I'm not saying, you know, it's the same way we were having this discussion, I think it was a year ago or so. Is it Anthony Tomasetti, who writes classical music reviews for the New York Times, was talking about virtuosity with pianists. And saying that there was, in the early 20th century, apparently, this is not my field, I was talking to Jeff about this, in early 20th century, you would have a couple of virtuosos in the world, which were not considered necessarily the most emotive or anything, but those who could, with absolute technical perfection, play the most complicated pieces. And he was saying now any good school has a couple graduating every year. And I thought, well, that's interesting. This was going to see these shows. I went to see the show at the MAC, as I'm sure a lot of you did. I'm going through, fascinating show, like super smart, very interesting. And then I go back past this mirror model of a reconstruct. I didn't realize at the time it was a project for the best showroom by Charles Moore, if I remember correctly. And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. And I look, and it was a reconstruction done by 2 recent SCI-Arc grads. And I thought, well, that's interesting. This is just, I'm not saying it's like more profound, but it's like, it's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah. It was just better made than anything else in the show. And I don't know what comes of that, but it is, and it's interesting, the relation of this with the 6th Street, and I don't want to make any claims for myself in terms of this, but you know, the fact of it is, I was a student at Harvard working with Bahram Shardel, who was very, very close with Daniel Libeskind. He had a full set of these. I would pore over them. I knew them even before I came there. I leave, I come to LA, I didn't know Tom Main from anyone. Paul Lubowicki tells me to go talk to him, and he had me sit down and do some drawings, and so I was like a disease vector, you know, the tsetse fly that came over and did something. And in fact, you know, to some degree, the geometry of the 6th Street house is not as eccentric as the geometry of the drawings. And Tom's later work ends up becoming quite eccentric indeed. So maybe Daniel's models of these are kind of disappointing, but a kind of, once an intuition is in the kind of the stream of things, once that die has sort of been released into the stream, somehow it shows up somewhere. You know, I was showing this when I give a class. I show these, one of the Malevich square, you know, the black square, right? And then showing some of his architecton constructions, like the black squares, amazing, right? Homage to the square. I'm looking at these tectons and they're really bad, and they're kind of crummy. But then I showed the Mises National Gallery in Berlin, right? And I think it was Kenneth Frampton was talking about this years ago, where there was some interview with Mies van der Rohe where they asked him if he had ever been influenced by the avant-garde Russians, and he said no, and especially not by Malevich. So I thought, so it just took a few decades, you know, but eventually once that, you know, you just think it's amazing, and he couldn't pull it off, but eventually once, that's where, you know, the artistry of it, whether it's in art or whether it's architecture, that you make a drawing that God knows how this thing, shit, I can't build this, is way more interesting than a building I'm describing. But if it's a valid kind of conjecture, I think it eventually finds its way out. Someone learns to do that magic trick.
Well, let me ask you, that, it gets me thinking, I mean, this will maybe be a slight jump in the conversation, but a lot of what, we started off today, I think, with geometry is always kind of underlying this thing, sort of geometrical construction and the precision with which those geometrical organizations are manipulated. And I think that's something that all 4 of these drawings share, and I think that a lot of the work in the show is similarly, you know, kind of in that world in a way. And I wonder, given the sort of topological complexity of more recent work, you know, we kind of get into the last 20 years or so, that there's a kind of legibility of the kind of organizational substrate, and even in a drawing as complicated as this, that you can start to kind of read out the various grids and construction mechanisms, et cetera. And when the work moves toward a more kind of topologically smooth idiom, let's say, I don't know if it's quite a paradigm, but I wonder how it changes the conversation, and I imagine we have very different attitudes about that in the room. But what do you think about that in terms of the distance between the kind of conversation we're able to have about this work and the kind of precision with which we're able to discuss it, and the state of conversation on sort of less platonically?
Well, I think that there's not even, the work you're referencing has no use for drawings in that way. That work is much more interested in its continuity and everything. It's much more about versioning, where there is lots of different things it can be.
Yeah.
We haven't yet developed the way to judge the good ones for the bad ones necessarily, so any one will do as well as another. And I'm overstating the case.
Yeah, because I'm
here.
not sure that there's
So
a lot
the
of
drawing
consensus on
drops
that.
out. It's really just a formula. It's an algorithm and a taped, so to speak, series of moves, slidings of toggles and stuff that will give you the object in the end. And so that precision is encoded in the machine and in the memory of the machine, rather than in any kind of primitive device like this. Mm-hmm. Now, we could say that this is in a way an algorithm for producing stuff too. It captures a sense of things, a sensibility, as Coy was saying.
But I guess the question that I'm trying to get at is like how do we account for the shift in the conversation required to move from one kind of system to another? It seems to me that I always find that I'm able to be much more precise talking about a drawing like this than I am talking about a lot of the stuff that we're doing recently. And I think we've seen even more recently, more geometrically controlled.
Well, again, the technology is so far out in front of us, we haven't yet developed the disciplinary tools to account for its effects. Mm-hmm. That's really just going to be a matter, I think, of time and practice and judgment.
So could we say that at the moment we're still our conversations are still governed by intuition, and we just got to wait for the erudition to catch up?
I think so.
I would take it somewhere else. It's interesting that in the show there's working drawings. And during that time, I know in the work in Tom and Michael's office, for instance, I was always struck by the axonometric details in the sets. So the evolution of describing a built project or to be built, a three-dimensional construct through two-dimensional drawings, a reduction and abstraction, we know is going away. In 10 years, there will be no drawings. We don't need it, and Wes's airplane will be every building we do. We'll be able to look at multiple views of it. Therefore, the content of that descriptive work will go away, and we'll just be left with these kind of drawings again, which require judgment to express an idea, and not a literalness of the object, which can be looked at in any sophisticated way, whose output will not be two-dimensional, by the way. We won't even print them. So that, I think, is the shift. I don't think we're there yet, and we see it on the horizon. But what's interesting to me about that will be, I believe there'll be a return then to a qualitative type of drawing that I'm trying to talk about today.
That's why in coordinating visual studies, I don't like the word. There's a term I don't like for it, visual studies, because I think that misses the point. That's why I had a seminar a couple of years ago I called non-visual studies, just to get the point across. But I always thought instead of that, here's a better term, studio techniques, which if one believes that creative work actually is created somewhere, and it's not a mental activity that one simply then draws what that mental thought was, and that's it. You're not actually creating the thing, it's simply notes to make sure that it coincides with what you had in your head. Then that means that the act of creating the thing has to happen somewhere. You need a kind of working space for it. And so I think the thing that drawing provided, let's say, back in the old days, oftentimes not. Let's all remember when these drawings were being done, everyone says, oh, whatever happened to hand drawing? Everything looked like shit. Everyone had the big fat pencils on Mylar and the electric erasers and all of that stuff. I mean, the idea of like the lost art of drawing was already lost by, World War II, I think. but the idea that there has to be a kind of working space, which is the media that one works through, and how one can both let that be projective of the building that it is going to produce, and at the same time let it be immanent in the sense that it is a kind of space where one can formulate the sensibility of the project. That is a much more complicated question than now. And so when you're looking at various other kinds of technologies and the increasing loss of a dependence on drawings, I don't think it removes the problem. In other words, it's still a creative act, and creative act actually has to be created somewhere.
But I think the irony, let's say here, is that hands over the history or the future of architecture to some guys in Silicon Valley who are building or creating the tools that we use to create the future of architecture in order to make better dinosaurs for movies.
Right.
And have filtered in, and certainly a dialogue has developed because they have come into the field and now the field is starting to work with them. But
Right.
the impulse to do this, the impulse to make buildings like this, it has taken so firmly hold, is not one that started in architecture. It's not like one where people sat around and said, buildings are just too square nowadays.
Right.
We've got to make more wiggly buildings.
Right.
And so let's go find a tool to
Right.
be able to do that. In fact, somebody, fortuitously or not, discovered that, this stuff could make these shapes. And then because of the very same skill set, let's say, that led us, frankly, to be having this conversation now about work that several people have already said should have been left 30 years ago.
Right.
But because of the entrepreneurial abilities of that group, their self-promotion, marketing, however you want to put it, we're here now. Because of the entrepreneurial and marketing abilities of a group who first discovered that digital software, the software, we are now talking about buildings that, kind of look more, I'm gesturing at the felt, not the concrete.
Well, actually, there's another argument, really quick. One could say that no, it actually started with CATIA and fighter jets.
But it didn't.
But this drawing, this
It did.
project is very interesting, John, that you selected. If we look at Stirling's axonometrics, I would say like the one that of the era that Todd showed is maybe more purely of that kind of more complex drawings of that. In terms of postmodernism, that's not going to be its strength. I mean, at least I already explained my disdain for that. What I think was interesting about this project, and a lot of people talked about, is the fact that through the same space, the city passes through and the museum passes through without crossing each other. It was actually topological. And I think that was the thing. You actually had this intuition that you could make these two things interlock without touching each other. That was independent of its stylistic, predilections, et cetera. It's fascinating because I would teach this building also until the Mercedes Museum came out just a couple miles away, which also has this kind of
Same.
And it's an interesting project in many ways to compare the two, and it's again virtuosity. One's a little bit like rocket science, and the other one isn't. But it's interesting if you look through the drawings. There still is a kind of plan logic, which is that trifoil, and there's even in that big book you can see these ways in which that. So there is a kind of evolution. I think there was a kind of. In other words, I'm not prepared to hand it over to saying that these tools came along and suddenly architects said we have to do that.
But
I think there were also intuitions that we
think-
needed to do something different.
Right, but those intuitions, right, are perfectly realizable with these tools at this level, at the way you're describing them.
Yeah.
Let's accept for a minute
right.
that maybe it was CATIA and fighter jets or helicopters or whatever that was the software. But again, that is software in service of performance effects that we gave up with the Streamline Moderne, by now 100 years ago. And clearly a building doesn't need to look like a fighter jet unless it's got some other agenda, right? And so I'm saying that the suggestion that fighter jet or CATIA and the abilities of CATIA connotes modernity or futurity or something like that is something that is separable from the actual form that stuff produces, and that stuff could actually produce yet other forms if the desire for that sense of futurity had led the borrowings from the other, whether it's dinosaurs or fighter jets.
But the way that the way that I'm hearing what Andrew's bringing into the conversation, and maybe I'm adding my own thing to it, but this drawing, I would say, and I think if you study the these axonometrics for the series of competitions that Stirling did through the 70s, this drawing, I think, is mostly about the weaving of different kinds of spaces, right? I mean, there's the space where you have to have a ticket to go, and there's the space that anybody can go. And I'm pretty certain that through those series of competitions, all those axonometric drawings, like this one, had to do with figuring out how one could choreograph the boundaries between these two spatial conditions. Because each one of those museums, Dusseldorf, Ulm, Cologne, they all had that kind of stitched circulation diagram. And so in a funny way, that this drawing, and I think this in a way explains its stylistic anonymity, that this is a drawing that's not actually about the object so much as it's about the routes through it.
This particular drawing, obviously features a route. That was the big innovation in the air that everybody cranked into their project, or tried to get that into their projects. But as all of those various other examples demonstrate, you can do that in lots of different ways, with lots of different formalisms.
So this one I think is much more about the tectonics.
And I do think, Wes, look, and if I'll make some claims for architecture, and I'm talking about that tiny, insignificant corner that we call the discipline of architecture, and not the big world. But eventually, KPF will do some version of whatever is produced by the discipline, or someone else will. But I think right now we're getting to a point where we've gone past thinking that the next tool that lands in our lap is going to give us the next architecture. In other words, that we could separate, say, an interest in
we've clearly plateaued.
Topological innovation needs to look like an illustration of a Klein bottle from a grade school book on science and math. So I think it is what's interesting now is it's simply a kind of optimistically a kind of cornucopia that one could do things technologically or atechnologically, and one simply has those options.
Yeah, I would agree. The stuff is here. The genie is out of the bottle, as it were. It's up to us now to figure out what architecture wants to do with it, which is what makes, say, somebody like Schumacher's attempt to turn this into some epical and singular style so amusing, because the whole point of this tool is the cornucopia, the infinite possibility of effects, rather than the honing of any particular stylistic effects.
Well, I want to, we're running a little...
The big answer to the question that no one was asking him for, right?
Yeah, but before we go down that Schumacher route, let's maybe open it up to the audience for a couple of questions, and then we can get on to the big finish from...
Andrew, I'm especially interested in hearing from Pat Morton, who's sitting there, our kind of in-house historian, and who contributed to your catalog too, because... At some point, not immediately.
Yeah, Pat, give us your question immediately. Anybody out there? And please wait for the microphone, which Reza is coming down. Reza, quick, get to Elena. We want to make sure that the next question is as far from Elena as possible.
Say something about technology and tools and drawings nowadays, just because I think we came out of 2 days of thesis reviews where weirdly enough, axonometric drawings done by the computer, with the computer, became fashionable to a point that at least I have to question whether or not these are the right tools for this generation. I just want to say that if I would be given a wireframe without shape of a number of architects that teach at SCI-Arc, I would be able to tell you from the wireframe how to use the tools and who did the drawing. So I just want to say this because I think when you work with these tools in an intimate way, as we have been doing for 20 years, actually, the way in which Andrew sees the drawings down there is the way in which we see wireframe on the computer now. I don't even need to see the shape to tell you exactly what tools has been used and how this inflected and changed the way of working, and that will inflect or not the way of creating a shape. I just want to say this because there is a weird misconception about drawings. And even when I see drawings done in visual studies classes where there is no understanding of what the computer can do, and you can tell the naivete behind the use of the computer when whoever is directing is not aware of it. So the intimate knowledge of the tool is actually something that is present in architecture no matter what. To me, it seems like the exhibition, in a weird way, was kind of a still life exercise, saying architects use these tools and doesn't really matter what the object is, because objects look quite different, actually, although the tools that have been used to create them are similar, and what ties them together is actually much more the effect of the coloration to me. These objects have been chosen because they look the same at the end of the day. But anyway, so the big question is it really the tool that defines what comes out of it, and is a projective geometry like the one we're looking in the show more abstract and more forgiving to what we obtain afterwards than computers are? And what is the role now? Why do we do an exhibition like this today? And why nowadays I see so many students going back to use tools that are really linked to the way in which you make things and draw things, and now they do it on the computer, and somehow you go back into this idea of, self-portrait for painters or apples and bananas for, the still life exercise. It seems like that kind of nostalgia in it.
For me, I think we should stop doing either perspectives or axonometrics. I'm just not sure what the next one is. Believe me, I'm tired of them.
Can I just say something to the, I'm totally down with the idea that a better knowledge of the tool will allow you to drive rather than be driven. I do think, though, that we are on a learning curve here that is so steep, or let's say a innovation curve that is so steep that certainly within the lifetime, if not the early careers of most of the students here, the evolution in the software that we are taking such incredibly extreme but still ultimately vocational efforts to learn and become intimate with, to master, will have evolved to the point, and it's evolving into a direction of greater transparency to natural language and gesture, will have evolved to the point that these vocational skills will obviously be obsoleted in a few years. But I think that they're actually approaching our desire. So the trick, I think, is not simply to become intimate with the particularities of release 4 at this point, or even the particularities of release 5 and 6, but the trajectory that is captured in them, embodied in the sets of commands, to how it is that we want to interact with these things, such that when the time comes that we're actually just making gestures in space and talking to Hal or whatever, and stuff is appearing holographically and altering holographically in front of us, which frankly is as well within our lifetime, if not, again, the short career, that we'll have put in place a system of judgment, an ability to understand better or worse versions of the things that we're attempting to make. Recognizing again that the trend also is toward a proliferation of possibilities. But I think that there is a tendency to valorize what to me are purely vocational details and therefore temporary, much more temporary than the evolution from the T-square and triangle to the drafting machine to the Mayline, or however that actually worked out. And so instead of losing sight in our fascination with the ability to actually make the software learn the layers and layers of menus and everything to get the software to know what we want to do, think a little bit more hard about what it is we want to do ahead of time. And then, obviously you're still slaves to the software to get it to do that, or to, in my case, hire somebody to get it to do that.
Joe. I'm reminded as you go through it, Wes, that I fear that the show and to a certain degree this panel reinforce what I hope isn't a baseline reality of our field, that every other generation gets to make gestures in space, and the generation in between has to make sense of them. And to a certain degree, I'm thinking, and I want to turn this over to Pat as quickly as I can, but Paulette's piece includes she mentions the magazine Wet, which was published in Venice in the 70s, would have been concurrent with a lot of this work. And I think to a certain degree captures the spirit. It's interesting how little I think any of the protagonists in any of the heretics would have been to enter into any of the technical conversation about how their work is produced. Because frankly, it was the generation following them, and on this panel there are 4 of you were instrumental, and I use that term in a loaded sense, in realizing some of the most iconic representations of the works of the 70s and 80s. And I think it's interesting to me that the generation after the heretics, a generation frankly that I consider far more central to my own development, maybe another generation after, would be such a strategically, categorically kind of stock-to-the-kite or dry reassessment of what in many respects seems like an expressionist tendency in the heretics generation. I feel like I personally am really drawn to the diagnostics here. I think, Andrew, you've done a great job of paring down the geometric convolutions that this show opens up that has actually a truly global impact on how advanced architecture reimagines itself through the 80s and 90s. This is sort of the DNA of deconstruction, at the very least, that you kind of outlined in those. And the 3 images that the 3 of you brought are interesting to me because what they share, well, they share black and white, but they share a kind of vectoral logic. The question of water flow is, at the end of the day, what makes that wall system of Israel's remarkable. The vectoral passage, the kind of deflected vector through Stirling, and certainly the kind of engineering that allows this radical vectoral movement of the fighter pilot. These kind of abstractions of both representation and architecture's ambitions as a discipline are, I fear, kind of I fear they're what are left to the generations that don't make more sentimental and gestural moves to kind of claim the field for themselves. And I think it's actually a kind of a misunderstanding of romanticism in our field not to think that those self-indulgences don't pay. I mean, frankly, Libeskind's image, which was up the most all afternoon, is interesting for, in a certain sense, his traitorship to his generation. He didn't make sense of the previous generation, he overwrote it. And he overwrote it by making an expressionism that was hyper dry as his generation would like it, but still incredibly gestural and infuriatingly personal as the last 20 years of his rhetoric around it attest. But I wonder how, I want to figure out where this, I want to figure out what the conversation is we're going to be having around all of your work in 10 years, and how.
Give us more time. 30 years.
I mean, I'll say that we've been spending a lot of time looking at this work and this period, and I think that's quite enough.
Well, let's take one last question from Pat, and then we'll.
Well, okay. I was really maybe want to pick up on something that Wes said, and it really resonated with some observations I had last night listening to Tom Main, in which Tom Main attempted to recuperate the history of social activism and turmoil of the 60s for this moment in '79, which I found quite hard to believe, frankly. But I think that there's a sense also, maybe it's a sense of guilt, I don't know, and I'm interested also in this kind of skipping generations issue, because one of the narratives about postmodernism, or it's maybe not a narrative, but one of the stories told about postmodernism comes from Venturi and the rejection of a social mission for architecture. And he says, no, architects should just do architecture, they should do what we do well. So my sense is, I had this sense last night that perhaps Main is trying to recuperate or kind of efface the Venturi story and recuperate some social mission. And so that was really interesting in terms of what Wes said about these empty gestures, the ways in which there was no social engagement that you perceived, that it was architects talking to architects. So maybe I would just throw that out as a topic to ask if that does seem to be an issue. 79, in many ways, it's really the height of a certain kind of postmodernism, but as many people observed, that maybe wasn't happening here. So what is the logic then in regards to that story?
Well, I was trying to make a personal point about my own experience. I was coming down here from Berkeley, I suppose by way of the GSD, but from Berkeley and San Francisco. That was my perspective, and I have to say that this is not a feeling that I consciously had at the time, but I definitely was I definitely, with my peers, had the sense that there was a whole lot of beautiful drawing and stuff going on, and there was a whole lot of aiming toward being in galleries and that sort of thing, and that's what we were being handed. But there wasn't a whole lot of, at the end of the day, there. It wasn't really standing for much in the way that even postmodernism, which we tend to vilify, at least stood for the idea that there would be meaning in architecture and that it would actually take its place as a public act with an intention to say something beyond the personal aggrandizement of its author. This stuff was intensely beautiful and seductive to us at the time. We all emulated it, but I think we all felt a little queasy about it. And I have to say that while I was a student and therefore was kind of safely prevented from building anything, my emulation and the emulation of my peers of this work was extreme. We did airbrush, we did Prismacolor, we did the whole 9 yards. But soon as we, not like overnight, but as we gained the ability to actually start to build things ourselves and act in the world, and the dawning vocation of architecture, the vocation of architecture and the implications of that began to dawn on us. I mean, this sounds disgustingly romantic as I'm saying it now. But I mean, we began to take it more seriously and start to think that, who am I to be imposing, some personal vision? Now, again, we've been criticized for having as personal a vision as anybody else in our work, but it certainly was our intention, our ambition, to make something that could be taken or consumed or understood as a vernacular, a community enterprise, something that embodied a true understanding of the way the world was, to science and science and the effects of science in the world through technology and engineering and that sort of thing. So, again, I have this fight with Eric every time in a public situation like this where he accuses my work of being as personal as his, and I say to him, point to anything in the work and I can give you a reason why it's there that has nothing to do with me, but has to do in theory with the program, however we invented it. And that, that was the thing I think that was kind of missing, the larger, for us from the work, the larger view of the world, the ability, the non-selfish possibility for the architect to stand there next to the work and say, you know what, this is how the whole world should be like this. This is how things should be.
But I think the question was more about social agenda, which, and on one hand, I think your perception was probably right. I wasn't here last night, but I can imagine the schizophrenia around the issue. It may be that in '79, where the projects that predominantly were smaller, single-family homes. I mean, one can argue, how can one have a social agenda doing house additions? That's one aspect, I would say. But I think that we have to be careful not to parse, which I see as a big problem culturally, where something cannot be beautiful and be social, or something cannot be overly complex and be sustainable. And there's a tendency to want to categorize certain architects or architectures, and I think probably last night's discussion had to do with the frustration of those architects who would like to have their cake and eat it too. Mainly that, yes, you can have those two things simultaneously. And I mean, this is no, I mean, we can talk about Tom's different statements here at the school, certainly at undergrad thesis reviews, and his criticism even of some of us and the work of the people here, which strangely enough has been leveled against him as well. So it's kind of interesting that he would bring it up. But perhaps that's indicative of another kind of struggle. And my own opinion is that we tend to parse these things too much, and that in fact multiple levels of architecture can actually work at that level and do.
Well, listen, I yesterday when we opened these events, I mentioned that one of the things that I quite liked about the work was its repeated demonstration of holding oppositions in tension. And so, I mean, one could look at a lot of the conversations that have gone on in the last couple of days cynically and say things like, boy, there's a lot of like unresolved paradoxes or glaring blind spots in the rhetoric. You know, so when you hear someone arguing in the same sentence for, I want engagement, I want significant political engagement and self-indulgent autonomy at the same time. I mean, and we heard a lot of versions of that kind of thing. And I think even in the drawings that were shown today, I found it interesting that, you know, that the Israel drawing was a kind of ink on mylar analytique, which is a kind of weird hybrid, or the Stirling combination of a sort of postmodern building rendered in a kind of modernist clinical way, or you know, the kind of strange flippages that we see in the Micromegas, or even the fact that was an after the fact drawing of the airplane, that there remains in this work that a kind of unresolved tension, that the answers remain kind of elusive. And I think that for me is what makes it so fun to go back to this stuff. That's what made these last couple of days and also these last couple of years quite fun for me as a kind of somebody that talks about this stuff a lot. And so I just want to, in closing, kind of thank everybody for participating. I think this has been a really good conversation. And I think in closing with, we're going to, well, I'll try not to give anything away, but I think we need like a minute or two to switch the computer, and then we'll close out with Hernandez Alonso. 20 seconds to switch the computer, so don't go anywhere.
Do we get to go down there? So
yeah, we're going to go down there so we can see. So I just want to thank everybody for getting in on this.
By now, the whole Confederacy of Heretics has become known among us as the heretic thing. You cannot believe how happy I am that the title of this is Closing Remarks. I really hope that these are the closing remarks about this. I don't think I can endure any more minutes of this. It feels by now that we've been doing and discussing things since '79, literally. So there's a couple of things, and really they're really random notes because I started to speculate about this a couple of days ago, and then with the discussion of the last 2 days, I keep switching it and switching it. Well, so a couple of things that I want to mention. One is, the first question is why we should care about to discuss this when the people who are the subject of the show, they are not even here with the exception of Coy, which I don't know if he's still around. Everybody else show up to their own discussion and then walk away. So clearly, history proves that people usually don't care about their own history. So Coy, as I said, Coy, you're the only heroic left of the people at the subject of the show. So truly, they don't care what the president has to say about them, with your exception. So I want to point out your graciousness. By the way, also your lecture yesterday was super interesting. Not as powerful as expected with having seen you with your shirt off, like it was at that time. Yeah, but nevertheless, I think it's an interesting point. So I want to start saying, in a way, that history in many ways is about the manipulation of facts and time, for the better and for the worse. And in that sense, I will say to Todd and Andrew that they did a remarkable show about that, and I also have the suspicions that they choose that particular time because the war was something that it will become interesting later. So in a way, I like this, the notion of old school, because there is something about the kind of a fake sense of fraternity about those guys, which are they're trying to pose to be younger than they really were. And there is a kind of immaturity about the war that I think is kind of interesting. But I would like to argue what Eric's opening quote yesterday, because it's one of the things that bothers me a lot as an Argentinian guy, which is this idea that history repeats himself. I think it's one of the things that is very smart to say, but actually it's not true. That's never true. History never repeats itself. It's bullshit. I always hate those things, like saying every time, everything in the past was better. Also bullshit. The present is always better than the past. But what interests me about that notion is the notion that because motivation and human ambitions remain fairly stable, the condition on how and why it happens are every time different. And I think this is why I think history never repeats itself. So when we are here 35 years later trying to care about these shows and the body of work that they represent, I want to point it out that there is a certain elasticity and a slowness in a way that architecture portrays itself. What I mean by that is this. I wonder on the arbitrary slices of history, because I wonder what I would be saying and what we would be saying if these shows were made about the work in 1985 versus 1979. I know that the 80s are not as sexy and polemic as the 60s, but guess what? Neither the second half of the 70s. This is 79. Okay? Not 63, not 65, and not even 69, even though the quotes that we keep listening for the couple of last days, it seems that this thing happened at the late 60s. So, no Nixon. Jimmy Carter was the president, which is a way more boring creature than Nixon. I understand why we want to talk about Nixon, but it was not Nixon. No Hendricks, was beyond dead by then. But actually, a lot was happening in 1979, but for some reason, it seems that the influence are coming from the 60s, and that's okay, because architects, as we know, we tend to move slower, way slower. But it seems that whatever virtues this project will have, they were mostly in embryonic state, a little bit like doing a show on the toddler years of Picasso. No, maybe there is one lesson to learn there, and maybe it's one that context and cultural influence should move faster in relation to architecture. But I would like to say that some of these arguments and the attempts to relate to the world or political, social climate sound a little bit naive and maybe honest and maybe elastic, but in any case, out of time. When I think about in 79 and the notion of Vietnam, what it comes to mind is one of the apocalypse now. The notion of the horror of that war to become a desperate understanding of cinematic poetry. So it's not really the idea of the actual fact of the war, it's the reinterpretation of the war and the horror of that as a way and as a means to understand our society and our culture. So we learn how to love the smell of napalm in the morning, the beauty of the sound of helicopter with Wagner music, and all those other things that come to the implication. And I wonder, why is that architecture always tend to choose to be on the downside of the curve of cultural influence? Which is one of my arguments that I will say later about why I think the present is always better than the past. So the 60s, of course, are fascinating. Muhammad Ali was, by that time, Cassius Clay, and he was gorgeous and fast. But actually, in 1980, he was pathetic and losing against a mediocre boxer like Larry Holmes. So there is something about going on about 79 and 80 world that is certainly not really quite in tune with what really was happening. The other thing, they were mentioned about the Rolling Stones as the counterculture, but by the 79, the Rolling Stones were mainstream and not polemic and not dangerous, but they were already a pinball machine. By then also, they only have one decent album left. I'm a big fan of the Stones, but the truth is Tattoo You in 1981 is the last good album that they ever produced. And by the way, it's not really an album, it's outtakes from the 78 album, Some Girls. So Keith Richards, that Wolf Pricks, a friend of the house and that part of group, of course, who doesn't want to be Keith Richards? But also we have to be careful because down the road, you became Jack Sparrow's dad and a commodity of Disney. So what context matters big time? When do things happen and why they matter? So, and just wonder. Now, '79, as I mentioned, there was a lot of stuff going on there. Never mind the ball of the Sex Pistols came and go. '77, the Sex Pistols were the most radical music eruption that we saw in the '60s, but by '78, they already were dissolved and it didn't exist anymore. That was a sign of the time that culture would start to move at a much faster pace, but for some reason, architecture keeps refusing of that, and I would argue that the less interesting work in the show reflects that, the slowness of that. On a footnote, this is completely unrelated to the argument, I want to say that I never met him, and I didn't know about him really until this show, but I truly miss John Dreyfus and that kind of journalism, particularly in the LA Times. Make of that whatever you wish. So the Sex Pistols were there, a whole notion of anti-expertise and anti-technique of control of disciplinary knowledge. And I think part of the work that we see in the LA scene, and I think the most interesting part of the show, to me, have to do with the misunderstanding of disciplinary expertise and what that engender. Sid Vicious, for example, never played in the album because he couldn't play. The Ramones, it seems also at that time that every group needs to be against the wall. So I want to mention that with the Blondie, which seems much more in tune with the graphics of the show, it was really some kind of a crossover between punk and disco. When the work established, and I think this work established a super clear flirtation with historical postmodernism, I don't agree with some of the assessment that there was a kind of distant flirtation. I think it was a full-fledged pornographic flirtation with postmodernism. And I said that as a good thing. I don't say that as a bad thing. But I cannot help that to think that in other fields, culture was working in a more radical and aggressive reconfiguration of the notion of expertise. So part of the thing I never found interesting about the postmodernism was the idea to keep reinforcing a certain historical tradition of expertise. Ultimately, I would argue, and by the way, disco was already on the way out. But at the same time, that lack of expertise and the challenges of that, it would evolve and became incredibly sophisticated and produce the work of people like The Clash and London Calling, which was in a whole other level than the Sex Pistols, but it couldn't exist without the Sex Pistols. So what I want to say is that ultimately, I would argue that the work, this work, what it shows us is a possibility of the notion of the individual obsession as a political disciplinary tool. And that is not the minor thing. So I will say there's something really important about the show is that, is the idea of the individual politics as a disciplinary cultural tool. That probably always has been present in architecture, but I would argue that this is one of the first times that that's become really evident, and it will become almost like a methodological and technique thing. So the notion of the individual intuition to become a technique. But I would argue that this is more on the promises of the work than what the project seems to be going. It's more where the projects will be going more than what they were at that time. Something along the lines, and this was talking with Joe Day last night, is something about the lines about you need to get worse before it will get better. So what other things were going on in '79? I just already mentioned punk, disco, and we have to be careful because after that we have Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet and a whole other thing that became a little bit horrendous. But it took a while to the genre to get sophisticated again. So the notion of the collective, love and peace, and imagination to power from the '60s, actually by '79 has become anarchy, dissolution, isolation, and a kind of a much more nasty and dirty world, which it seems to me quite interesting. And in a way, I think the work has a little bit like that. So I would argue that part of the work that we see here will become the blueprint for a different individual collective set of relationships. What I think I would argue endures until now in the LA culture, in the architectural LA culture. But also, I would like to say that we should not look only in the past, but the past should look also to the present. Unlike the notion that every past was better than the present, I would argue that the present is always more interesting and dynamic and full of options and precise than the past. And in a way, that's the best compliment that we can pay to that body of work. I am never sure about the value of retrospective and historical work because I truly believe that architecture only can really operate in the present. So one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is I was educated in Argentina by disciples of Tafuri, Rossi, Purini, and the Italian guys, and some older guys that were all fanatics and Le Corbusier miss. And I was taught to completely distrust the LA work. The Los Angeles work was considered superficial, corrupt, non-rigorous, don't been there, not there. And when I moved here and started to think, I thought there was a whole different world, and maybe they were right at some point, and maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, that a certain notion of corruption and superficiality and banality can operate and trigger new possibilities. So I was sure if we flip the meaning of that criticism, we can revert to and argue that these were necessary steps toward the creation of something new. So also another thing going on in '79, Steve Jobs came with Lisa, the second version of the personal computer. So a lot of things were going on, and of course, they came away 3 days ago with a new Mac Pro. In 35 years, that's what we used to have, this is what we have. So in many ways, we can argue that at least at the technological level, for sure the present is better than the past. And I'm not so sure what that does to us, but also another interesting thing, in '79, the Lakers were great, and they were winning with Magic Johnson, and not the pathetic version that they are of themselves now. But I want to mention that also some of the guys in that show, they went on to remain and became relevant. The notion of relevance was talked a lot this morning. And I think it's important to understand, to me, a fundamental idea of relevance is the idea to keep evolving and keep updating. I think it's quite important for us as an institution, a place like SCI-Arc, but also I would stand that, to use LA to understand, to don't be nostalgic and try to figure it out what value that work that was done, it produced for us to the present. So I will say that part of the notion of the ambition of the corruption and individuality, I think in many ways is nurtured in the work of some of the younger guys here in the school. And I think to understand, you can see that desire for useless obsession, things that doesn't need to be done, but we do it anyway for other reasons than practical deployments. And this is a whole collection of work of faculty and students mix. So you can see that there is certain things that at that time were introduced on a certain start having insinuation. Then I think it takes to a whole other level over the period of time. And I think that is an important part if we want to understand what to do. So I think this idea that history repeats himself, again, I don't think it's true. I think an interesting notion for any kind of aspirational revolution is to accept that eventually it has to become an evolution. And I think, to me, that a little bit what the work is there, and I think there is, Todd asked me to see if we couldn't relate the discussion of them with the discussion now, and I'm not so sure that that is possible beyond this idea of the notion of obsession as a political cultural entity. The other thing is that I want to conclude to also not refuting but arguing with this obsession that Eric has with Don Quixote, which in pretty much every other lecture he will bring up in his introductions. And I am absolutely committed that part of that is, I think you have to read Don Quixote in Spanish to really fully understand what it means. One of the things is, there is never any doubt in the book that Don Quixote was insane, that the monsters were not monsters, they were what they were. So this idea that is open to interpretation is not really true. It's always clear that the guy is insane. Now, we can choose to believe that the insanity became the reality, and I think that's part of our DNA. And I think that's what makes LA and SCI-Arc peculiar. I think it's a choice. But it's not, I think, it's fact. That's why I think the manipulation of history and fact is an important one. But I really want to think that the notion of nostalgia and retrospective, it seems almost antithetical to LA, and he thinks almost antithetical to SCI-Arc, and he thinks almost antithetical to the good work and the good guys in that show. So to me, this is a kind of a very strange thing what we're doing. I mean, in a way, I think it needs to be done, but at the same time, after it is done, I'm not so sure why we needed to do it. So I want to be clear. The other thing which is interesting is, in the conclusion, is this is Terry Gilliam trying to shoot Don Quixote de la Mancha in 1999. He couldn't make it. He ran out of money. The guy playing Don Quixote got sick and died. For many reasons, never can done. And they did an amazing documentary about the failure of making the movie. And I have the feeling that that's a little bit the territory where we are. And I want to say, to conclude, that despite popular belief, science tells us that we cannot choose what to remember. We cannot choose what to remember. We think that we can, but we can't. But if we are not very destroyed by bad life habits, drugs, alcohol, or whatever you want to call it, we potentially can remember everything. But we can choose about what to care about what we remember. And I think this is the key moment. What do we choose to care about what we remember? Now, any historical reading have implications for the audience, critical and selective. But if you're the subject of that historical reading, and if you are alive, which in this case they are, but they're not here with the exception of Coy, so might as well we can play that they're dead in this analysis. If you're alive, you can understand that the value is in your own trajectory. In other words, the relevance is different for the audience than is for the ones who did it. And sometimes we tend to confuse that. So we see it that, we as an audience, we see it as facts. Tweaked, manipulated, but they're still facts. With the author, they see it with all the complexity of their own obsession. So that's why some of the influence go 15 years before what they were thinking that they were doing. So one of the things I would argue for the few students that are here is, I think architecture, honestly, one of the things I like about the present, there is an immediacy, and it's true what we discussed in this morning, that it's too much information, we move too fast, and sometimes we don't have to digest it. But I take that every day on the weekend, twice on Sunday, under the idea that we have to speculate for 15, 20 years to propose something. I think architecture needs to become much faster in that sense, even though at the risk, and sometimes to be a little bit superfluous and lacking depth. But I think it's a necessary change that we need to do, and that would argue that that's what I think the tools and the techniques and the methodology that we're working right now are, in my money, way more exciting. Now, I would say we will not be there, we will not be here without that. So I think that this is an important part, and I think that I would argue is important in terms of history. So to conclude, I want to show you a successful clip from a successful movie of Terry Gilliam. And by all means, I'm So we did it. Let's move on. Thank you.